walking the serpentine path, following the footsteps of the ancestors, walking the serpentine path, making our way back home. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho, hey ya, hey ya, hey ya, ho. Hey ya, hey, hey ya, ho. Following the serpentine path. Life.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Serpentine Path podcast. My name is Claire Wowdy Yassid, and I will be your guide on the serpentine path of life. I'm a songkeeper, plant walker, storyteller, word weaver, artesana, visual and performance artist, daughter, granddaughter, sister, lover, student, and friend, among many, many, many other things. I've spent my life traversing through altered states of consciousness and find it fascinating to explore all the ways in which our modern culture has become almost entirely severed from our innate instinctual and intuitive ability to see beyond the veil of so called reality. In this podcast, I will be sharing my own personal stories and insights regarding all things related to plant medicine, the birth, death, rebirth cycle, ancestral reconnection, intergenerational healing, womb sovereignty and bodily autonomy, dream work, rites of passage and initiations, time travel, shape-shifting, dimension hopping, and the reclamation of our collective earth-based practices, all of which I consider to be portals into altered states of consciousness. I thank you with my deepest respect and humility for taking the time to open your ears, your minds, and your hearts to what it is that I have to share. The telling of one's story is an intimate and vulnerable experience. It is also, in my opinion, one of the most powerful, illuminating, liberating, and healing medicines that a person can offer to the world. Hearing the cadence in a storyteller's voice, their laughter, their tears, their tone, their pauses, their pain, their joy, their curiosity, and their heart's song is something that can only truly be experienced by way of oral storytelling. Thus, in honoring the storytelling lineages of all of our ancestors, I offer my story to you now. In another world, another time, another dream, we're all sitting together in front of a big fire, passing our visions across the flames and receiving the medicine in our hearts. So, again, welcome to the serpentine path where the ancestors have called us back to. Let's start at the end and find our way back home together. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm going to be sharing about my gender journey today, which I've touched on in a few previous episodes, but I'm going to be going much deeper today. And to just begin, I'm going to be really clear and say this is my experience, my path with my gender, and how I see things now. Wherever you're at on your gender journey, whatever visions and perspectives that you have about yourself, I honor and respect because You have every right to explore and experience what it is you want to explore and experience. But again, this is just my vision now after everything that I've been through. So I'll start at the beginning, which is my childhood. I have always felt really uncomfortable with girlhood and womanhood. But beginning in my childhood with girlhood, I have two younger sisters who are both very stereotypically feminine just in regards to their interests. As kids, they really loved dress up and makeup and tea parties and playing dolls and all of that kind of stuff. And that never ever held any interest or sway for me when I was a kid. I was very much a tomboy, super sporty, very athletic, and always just wanted to be outside, running around the neighborhood, biking, climbing trees, going out into the open space, and scabbing my knees and playing football at recess or like foursquare or tetherball or whatever. I just wasn't aligned with a lot of aspects of girlhood. And that was really uncomfortable for me in a lot of ways, particularly in regard to the relationships that I had with both of my sisters. I felt very left out and very strange and very awkward and weird. And still do a lot of times with my sisters because I am so different from them, even though I love them dearly. And they're some of my favorite people in the entire world, but I'm just so different. And that kind of translated to like all other girls as well. I had a lot of kind of weird niche interests as a kid, and I was pretty obsessive about those strange niche interests. And other kids just kind of like couldn't get down with it. And I didn't know how to talk about anything else other than what I really cared about, what my special interests were. And I didn't really know how to connect with people, and I didn't know how to build friendships. And it all just seemed really, really confusing to me. And I remember a moment from my childhood that had a really big impact on me, which was that when I was 7 years old, probably, it was a really hot summer day, a beautiful day in Colorado, where I grew up. And I was in the backyard with my babysitter. And it was like probably 7 at night, like right when the sun is starting to set during the summertime. And it was so hot, and I was sweating, sweating, sweating. And I did what I had seen all of the neighborhood boys do, which was I took off my shirt and I just ran around the yard. And I felt so free and I felt really good because I finally wasn't hot. And I'd just been so hot all day. And my babysitter came over to me and she said, "Claire, sweetie, you have to put your shirt back on." And I remember being so confused. I was like, but I'm so hot. Like, you know how a 7-year-old brains work. Like, there was just no making sense of that. I was like, I am so hot. I can't put another shirt on. What are you talking about? And I was like, I'm not doing that. And she was like, "Claire, it's really important. You need to put a shirt on." And I was just kind of pushing back. I was like, but why? Why do I need to put a shirt on? It's really hot. I'm sweating. The boys do it all the time. Like, what's the big deal? To which she said to me, "Well, you're a girl, so you can't do that." And again, I was just so confused. I was like, why? Like, I'm not understanding. I'm not tracking. And I asked again, why? And she said, because when you get older, you're going to have breasts like me. And when you have breasts, you can't take off your shirt and show them. So you need to put on a shirt. And it was such a strange moment for me because I felt really embarrassed, like I had done something wrong. I felt really unsafe in my body. And I felt those kind of first moments of being sexualized, even though my babysitter, of course, was not sexualizing me, but she was putting this like future idea in my head that at some point in time I was going to be someone that people would see as a sexual being, and that part of my body needed to be covered. And so I remember that moment a lot. And I think a lot about how we can teach children appropriate boundaries when it comes to their body and how to talk with them about their body and all of that kind of stuff. But that's a conversation for another time because this did have a really drastic impact on me. And it was around this time, too. I remember I also had a moment when I started school that year, my second grade year. We did picture day, and my mom forced me to wear a dress to picture day. And I am not kidding when I say, like, I hated my mom for making me do this for, like, I don't know, weeks or months. Like, I held on to this resentment towards my mother. I never said anything to her ever, but I was so angry and so upset and so embarrassed that I had been forced to wear a dress to school because I was just this little tomboy. I was like, I wear pants, I wear shorts, I don't wear anything girly, I'm allergic to pink. I need to be able to wear clothes that I can run around in at recess and like gym time because that was my favorite thing. I was such an active little kid and a sporty little kid. I was a dancer, I played soccer, I did gymnastics. Again, I loved football at recess. I loved all of like the sports, everything. So I was so angry at my mother for forcing me into a dress. I have forgiven her, but hated her for a while. And I remember like all of my gender presentation also kind of had to do with like how uncomfortable I felt with girls. I was really bullied by a lot of girls throughout like my entire life. Honestly, I have a pretty big wound when it comes to women. I've done a lot of deep healing with that, thank God, but from a very young age, I experienced a lot of bullying from other girls, and I think it was just because I was so different and so strange and um, didn't know how to connect at all and had all these weird interests that I wouldn't shut up about when I did start talking. Otherwise, I was very shy and didn't share very much. And so I made it through like my, childhood and kind of early tween years. And I was awkward and I was uncomfortable, but I was making my way. But I was really embarrassed about my body too. I remember I had a dance teacher who said something along the lines of she was talking to the class and she said, "Girls, you guys need to watch how Claire and this other boy in the dance class, how they jump because Claire has really strong boy legs." And I remember I did not wear shorts and I didn't wear anything that showed my legs for like years after the fact because I had been told that I had boy legs. But it was also supposed to be a good thing because when we were going across the floor in ballet class and we were doing, big jumps, I could jump really high. And so it was confusing to me because it was like, I obviously don't want to have boy legs. I want to be seen as a girl, but also I guess it's a good thing to have boy legs because I know that I'm a really beautiful ballet dancer and it was supposed to be a compliment. So there's just so much confusion around my body. And there was a lot of covering up as a kid. There was a lot of not wanting to show my body off at all, being really uncomfortable in like bikinis and at the beach or at the pool, any of that kind of stuff. And just not wanting to be seen as girly or just straight up as a girl. So when I moved into my teenage years, I started looking around at all of the girls in my class that were starting to get male attention. And my puberty was pretty delayed. I got my period like the last out of everyone in my friend group. I was almost 14, which isn't that late, but it is a little bit later. And I had like no boobs, no butt. I was just like this completely little rectangular little rectangle, really skinny and kind of lanky and awkward. And I had a lot of girlfriends who were developing breasts and whose hips were getting wider and who were developing a body that we would see more as like a woman's body. And I was so delayed in that. I actually didn't end up really getting like a woman's figure until I started going on birth control when I was like 16 and 17 years old. But I was looking around at all of the girls who were getting male attention, and I saw how they dressed. And I saw the makeup that they wore. I saw the clothes. I saw how they held themselves and how they talked. And I was like, okay, well, I'm really awkward and kind of weird and shy and uncomfortable, but I do kind of want to explore this. I don't know, this kind of love story thing that people are going through. Like people have had boyfriends and people have had their first kisses and people have gone on dates to the movies and I still haven't done that yet. And so how do I get there? And I was like, well, clearly something's got to change because how I'm presenting myself now is not attractive to boys. So I'm going to have to kind of change a lot of things about myself if I want a guy to like me. And so that's what I did. I started really changing my appearance, dressing much more feminine and eventually more and more kind of like sexy and seductive. I didn't have a dress code at my school. I went to a performing arts school from 6th grade until all the way through high school. We didn't have a dress code. Don't know if that is a good or a bad thing, but it was what it was. And so, yeah, like tiny little crop tops and teeny tiny little short shorts and showing off a lot of skin and lots of, push up bras and makeup and all of that, just in an attempt to get a boyfriend. It's all I wanted for a while. I just really, really wanted a boyfriend and I wanted to experience what everyone else was experiencing. And I felt like I was really missing out and I felt really uncomfortable and like this awkward late bloomer. And so I was just trying really hard to perform femininity, this version of femininity that I thought was going to be attractive to boys. And eventually it did work. Potentially maybe a little bit too well, in that my first like few experiences with boys actually ended up being very non-consensual and I would say sexual assault, like those first 3 experiences of hookup culture in high school. That was super unfortunate. I've done a lot of healing around it. I'm really at peace with it now, but being like a 16 and 17-year-old girl and having those kinds of experiences as your first introduction to sex, like it's pretty heartbreaking. So, moving forward, I did get into a serious relationship, which I talked about in the previous episode. Women carry the seeds if you haven't listened to it, but I got into this relationship with this man that ended up being a very abusive relationship in a lot of ways. And I'm going to do a whole episode talking about that situation, but essentially, one of the parts of a lot of control in our dynamic was that my partner had a lot of visions about how I was supposed to dress, what my hair was supposed to look like, what shoes I was going to wear, how much or how little of my body I was going to be showing off, and what like an appropriate version of femininity was meant to look like for his girlfriend. And throughout our 5-year relationship, I really conformed to that, right? I had already gotten into a place of like pushing all of my discomfort down when it came to stereotypical femininity and performing. And so it kind of makes sense that in his mind, he was like, well, she's this stereotypical feminine girl. And so, like, yeah, she should be wearing heels when we go out to parties. And she should be, dressing in like kind of tight form fitting stuff. And she should always have makeup on her face. And she should, and she should, and she should. Because that's also what I was believing. He was just a reflection of where I was at that point in time, which was all of these ideas around what womanhood was supposed to be. And so I did all of that, but I never did it good enough for him. And that was a big point of contention in our relationship. All of the comments that he made about my body weight, my body hair, um, my appearance, like everything was just really, really, really painful and inappropriate. I don't accept that at all in my current relationship. My partner has never even tried to pull any of that bullshit with me, but that was a big part of our relationship, the control over my feminine expression. And so things started to kind of change when I guess it was the summer I turned 21. I graduated from university when I was 20 years old, and I immediately moved to Venice, Italy, where I lived for 3 months, and I was dancing at the Venice Biennale, which, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Biennale, it is this big arts festival, this international arts festival that happens in Venice, Italy every summer. So I was living there, and when I was there, my roommate was a lesbian, and I remember there was one night where we were talking about sexuality. And it was interesting because I said to my roommate, I feel pretty comfortable with like heterosexuality. I think that that's how I see myself. I haven't really questioned it that much ever. However, my gender, like that's kind of something that I have more questions about. And I can understand more, people who are exploring like different presentations of gender and gender fluidity. Like that is more interesting to me than like doing a lot of excavation around my sexuality, which actually changed a lot when I went off of birth control. My sexuality did change fairly drastically. Um, I'll talk about that at some point, probably a future episode. But that's when like these ideas of gender and like different gender presentations started coming to the forefront of my mind. And this, of course, wasn't anything new. Like, since my childhood, I had been really struggling with it, but it was coming into the collective consciousness. These ideas of gender fluidity and non binary and gender queer and gender variant and all of the terms that people can try on with their gender. And so I was going through this process. And it was also really interesting because being at the Biennale in Italy was the first time that I was surrounded by a lot of queer women, and not just dancers, but like queer artists in general. And I was seeing women who were presenting their femininity really differently, and or like completely divesting from femininity at all. I saw people who were dressing actually very masculine and really tough. And there was something really enticing and exciting about the freedom of that, of seeing women who were dressing how I knew I wanted to dress, kind of like bigger, baggier, tougher clothes, maybe with like some little gold jewelry or something like a little bit feminine with like a strong red lip, but like totally baggy clothes and really tough. I don't know how to explain it, but I was looking for like this mix with my gender, and just more freedom is really what it was at the end of the day, more freedom, especially based on what I was living in my relationship, which was like no freedom at all. So I started really playing around, and I had a lot of fun with that actually. But I do know that there was definitely a part of me that was really rebelling within my partnership, my abusive relationship. Because the more and more that I started dressing like a little bit more gender fluid, a little bit more masculine, my partner was not having it. Like he was, ooh, he did not like it. And it became a big point of contention in our relationship. We were long distance, and so we only saw each other like every few weeks. But almost every single time, I remember there being fights about what I was wearing, like, which is so funny to me now because I cannot imagine getting in a fight with anyone, much less like a romantic partner, about what I'm wearing. But that was a really big part of our relationship for a while, fights over, at the end of the day, it wasn't about what I was wearing, right? It was about how I was presenting femininity and how I was not meeting his expectations of the type of woman that he was supposed to be dating. So I just kept pushing and pushing and pushing, kind of the extremes of my gender presentation. Again, really baggy clothes, really tough. I was living in New York City at this point in time. I had been for a while, but I was living in New York and I just wanted to feel tough. I wanted to feel like I had armor. I wanted to feel like people couldn't fuck with me. And so I wore stuff that did not show off any of like my figure because I was scared, honestly. And I can look back on it now and see how drastically those early experiences of sexual assault, how big of an impact they had on me, and also everything that was going on in my abusive relationship, because there was also a lot of sexual coercion and pressuring, and there was just this part of me that was like really scared to be seen as a woman. And so I was just like covering up and trying to hide and trying to make myself seem like as physically unattractive as possible, if that makes sense. I didn't want to be seen as feminine in any way. And I kept going deeper and deeper with this. I eventually ended up, as I said, questioning my sexuality. I think when I first decided to come out, I said I was like pansexual or something. And then I was bisexual. And now, honestly, who knows and who cares? It's not so important to me these days. But then I eventually did come out with my gender. And I think at first I said I was gender fluid, and I very gently started kind of asking people to also include they, them pronouns for me, along with she, her pronouns. And things started really shifting. At a certain point, I got like much more attached to a non binary identity and being seen as that. And I became more and more adamant and like forceful about people not seeing me as a woman, and being really upset and hurt and triggered and like really, really hypersensitive of people's language and how they referred to me, and having like full blown panic attacks when people would refer to me as a woman. Like it was really intense, you know? And there is something that I'm going to touch on, which I think is super important, because I see it a lot within queer communities, within like white spaces, and just white people within queer community, which is that I can track it back now to when I started getting really attached to my non binary identity. Was also during the Black Lives Matter protests in like May 2020. I believe those started in May of 2020. And something that I find really interesting about my whole gender journey and trajectory with that was that when the Black Lives Matter movement started, there was no part of me that wanted to be white. I was so ashamed of being a white person. And I was so scared of being seen as racist, being seen as a Karen, or what are the other terms that they throw around for white women? I don't remember. It's not important. But I was so disgusted and horrified and embarrassed and ashamed and guilty about my whiteness, which is something that I think all white people can understand, and something that all white people really need to work through. I mean, they don't have to do anything, people can do what they want. But I would invite all white people to like really sit with the shame and the guilt around whiteness and everything that we do to try to escape from whiteness, and the lived reality of being a person with white skin moving through the world and coming from the lineages that we come from. So I was just like, oh my God, like I cannot escape whiteness. I can't escape being a white person. However, the more and more that I really push being non binary and also being queer in other ways, the more and more I can distance myself from whiteness. This was what I was thinking in my head. And it was interesting because the more that I attached to a non binary identity, the more that I pushed my they them pronouns, the more that people kind of listened to and valued what I said. When I was a white woman, that was not, I didn't receive that level of genuine, like, people hearing me out and people caring about what I had to say. But the moment when I positioned myself as, I'm a non binary person, do not see me as a woman, like being really adamant about the supposed oppression that I was experiencing from cis heteronormativity as a non cisgendered person, all of these terms, whatever, the more that I was able to, in my mind, and also very much like in a social context, to be able to kind of position myself further away from white oppressor and closer to like an ally with oppressed people, because I too was experiencing the violence of the cis hetero white supremacist patriarchy, capitalism, all the terms, right? So I can look back on that time now and completely align that moment when I became so adamant about being seen as non binary and being really angry at people who called me a woman, or being like really like in this victim place of like, oh my god, but they use the wrong pronouns for me and this is horrible. And I'm like having, I mean, I really did have like full blown panic attacks. I really did think that I was experiencing very severe gender dysphoria. And I was actually. I wouldn't say I was experiencing severe gender dysphoria. What I was actually experiencing was the ripple effects of a lot of sexual trauma. Like a lot of sexual trauma, and I'll touch more on that moving forward, but in my mind, it was sexual trauma from my teenage years and also from my abusive relationship, and also throughout a lot of sexual relationships that I had in my 20s. In conjunction with, you know, a really strong non binary identity, I was very deep within the queer community. I was really deep into like a lot of kind of social justice organizing stuff that I now look back on and I'm like, what was I doing? Um, I was really deep into like what they call, I guess, the sex positive community. I was exploring a lot of things with my sexuality, but I was also really not aligned with how to respect my sexuality, actually, and how to respect my body. And it was very strange because, in a way, I was hyper sexualizing myself in a very feminine way. When it came to my sexuality, I didn't want to be seen as a man necessarily. I wanted my femininity to be attractive to men. I also primarily only dated straight men. There were a few other kind of queer people that I dated, both queer in terms of gender, queer in terms of sexuality, but for the most part, I was dating straight men. And so it's so fascinating to me because I was in this place where I was like, I am not a woman. Don't you dare call me a woman. Do not see me as a woman. You and I are not in a heterosexual relationship because I'm not a woman. But also, when we're having sex, I want to feel feminine and I want to feel like a woman, which is still like a big brain fuck for me now. I'm like, Claire, what was going on? Like, your poor brain, you poor girl, like, you were so confused. And I also have a lot of empathy for a lot of the guys that I dated, but one guy in particular who was trying so hard to understand what the hell I was saying. And at a certain point, I think it was just like all too much for him, and the relationship ended, which is all good. Hope he's doing well. But I was in this phase where I was like fighting so violently, like really fighting with my whole core and being and my words and all of my identity and how I saw myself, fighting against femininity just so aggressively. And then on the flip side of it, like when it came to intimate and romantic and sexual relationships, I wanted to be seen as feminine in ways. And I wanted the comfort actually of like a heterosexual dynamic. And I wanted to understand how to relate to straight men in a healthy way because I hadn't had that in my long term abusive relationship that was 5 years long. And so there was this part of me that I was just trying to figure it out, dude. I was so lost and I was trying. But so what started to really shift everything for me was that I started my path with Jahe at 24 years old. I went to the Colombian jungle for the first time, way deep into the jungle, like 4 hours hiking through the mud. And I drank the medicine of Jahe, the medicine of ayahuasca, for the first time. So to be clear, within the jungle territories of South America, gender in indigenous communities is very, very binary. There are men and there are women, and there is nothing in between. My feeling is that pre colonization, that was not the case because we have so much record of so many different gender expressions and gender roles and community roles from the nations of the North, the indigenous nations of the North, that have still somehow survived through colonization, which is pretty remarkable. But in the South, that is not a thing, right? And so coming to Latin America for the first time, there is no like, unless you're like in the cities like Bogota or Medellin or Cali, or like if you're in Ecuador, like in Quito or whatever, there is no conversation of anything transgender, non binary, gender fluid, gender variant, nada. Like, that's not a thing. It's not even part of the collective consciousness. There's no conversation around it. So I came to Latin America and then I went to the jungle. The jungle, again, very binary. And I remember being in ceremony, and one of the nights that I drank my cup of medicine, I was sitting by the fire and I just heard this word over and over and over again. I just heard woman, 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 woman over and over and over again. And I was so uncomfortable. And I was like, no, shut up. Like, no, get out of my face. I cannot hear even that word. Like, it brought up so much pain for me, so much pain, right? And I went back to New York and I kept going with my whole non binary identity, and I was still pretty adamant about it. And I went back to the jungle pretty soon after. I went back like only 6 months later. And the same thing happened in ceremony. Woman, 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 woman. All of this coming up for me. Woman, 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 woman. And I just like couldn't hear it. And I remember hearing things like, it's beautiful to be a woman. It's safe to be a woman. It's sacred to be a woman. Woman, beautiful woman, beautiful woman. And again, it was just so painful for me because I had built this entire identity around this idea that womanhood like physically hurt me, like that it caused me pain and suffering. So I just couldn't touch it still. And even after that, like it still took over a year for me to come to peace, to even begin coming to peace with womanhood. And what really shifted things for me was the fact that I was in a ceremony again. I was back in the jungle and I was with my teacher, Abuelo Kerouin. And I took a cup of medicine and I was trying to figure out what was going on with me because I had been dealing with a really bad womb infection. I had horrible abscesses in my uterus and I actually almost lost my fertility. And so I was trying to figure out what was going on with my vagina and my womb and just my reproductive health in general. And what ended up happening was that I started to see very clearly that I had been sexually abused as a child, which I'm going to touch on a lot more in a future episode. But that was like what kind of ripped the band-aid off of everything in my life. Like every single wound, all of my struggle with substance abuse, all of my severe struggles with eating disorders, all of my mental health issues, all of the issues that I had with my family, all of like, how I had ended up in an abusive relationship in the first place, what my relationship had been with men, for my whole life, but then also like this hatred of my gender. So my hatred of girlhood and my hatred of womanhood. So, long story short, over the next many months, I was really deep in my healing process. I was in the jungle with my teacher alone. My partner was not there with me. I was with abuelo and abuela both, and I was in ceremony probably 3 to 5 times every single week for over a year, actually. And every single ceremony, I was going through all of the times that I had experienced sexual abuse in my life. And I was getting little parts of my soul back. That's how it felt. And every time that I got a little part of my soul back from all that sexual abuse, I felt a little bit safer in being a woman. Just a little bit. It was such a slow process. Little by little by little. I just understood, like, wow, okay. Yeah. Maybe it is good to be a woman. Maybe it is beautiful. Maybe it is normal. Maybe it is natural. Maybe it is special. Maybe it is sacred. Maybe it is powerful. Maybe I'm a woman. Maybe I am a woman. Maybe I'm okay with this. And so in conjunction with that, again, I was living in an indigenous village where there is no genders outside of man and woman. And I was seeing how the women in the village moved through the world. I was seeing how they saw themselves, I was seeing how they related to one another, and more than anything, I was seeing their community roles as mothers and as grandmothers. So I don't want to romanticize or like create some version of Indigenous womanhood that strips Indigenous women of their humanity, because there are plenty of parts of Indigenous womanhood that, I don't align with. However, what I will say about this experience of living with Indigenous women here in the jungle is that there is a sense of just very clear knowing of what it means to be a woman and what your power is. And there's also a very different social status in Indigenous cultures that comes with becoming a mother and becoming a grandmother or potentially a great grandmother. A lot of the women here end up becoming great grandmothers when they're not that old, actually, because a lot of the time in Indigenous communities, people start having kids by the time that they're like 15, 16, 17, 18, between like 15 and 20, people start having kids. And so to see the role that mothers had and that grandmothers had in a community, I feel like it was the first time that I really looked at a woman and I saw her just completely in her power. And not like empowered, not like someone gave her power, but a woman who just knew so deep in her bones who she was, what her role was in her community as a creator of life. And she was just unwavering and unquestioning in her womanhood and in her femininity. And so I was around all of these women and I had the experience of, okay, well, how do women bond here in the jungle? Okay, well, there's one way that they bond which I can't participate in now because I'm not yet a mother, but I can get to know their kids and spend time with their kids because the women are with the children, right? What's another way that they bond? Well, they cook together. They're always cooking together and laughing and sharing and preparing food, cooking over the fire, doing that. So I started to ask them, can you teach me how to make this? Or how do I do that? Or, I want to learn how to butcher a chicken and how to take out all the organs and everything. Can you show me? And they were at first really surprised that a white girl wanted to learn all of that kind of stuff. And they were like, yeah, sure. So I started building my relationships with them. I saw that the women bonded when they would be working on artesanías, which is all of the weaving and the beaded work that they do. And so I learned how to bead and how to weave with my teacher, Abuela Maria. And what I saw was that the women would get together and they would be doing their beading and their woven work, and they would talk and they would laugh and they would ask questions and they would get support and they would share recipes and they would share medicines and they would share advice and they would connect. And so I started doing that with them. I saw that the women would connect by, going out into the fields and planting and harvesting food. And they would go out with their big machetes and they would be slicing through the jungle, really powerful and really just like no nonsense, like boom, boom, boom. And they would just go and walk. And so I was like, okay, well, I should probably learn how to like plant food because that's also a lot of value that is placed on women in the village. Like, does this woman know how to plant food? Does she know how to feed her family? Does she know how to care for her community? No? Well, she needs to learn. So I started seeing all of these aspects of womanhood that I had never put any value on before. I feel like I had never been taught to place value on childcare or motherhood in general. And that's an issue that I do take with a lot of feminist thought. There's a lot of aspects of feminism that I can certainly align with, but there's many aspects of feminism, particularly in regard to the, what is the word? Devaluation of motherhood and the sacredness of motherhood and how mothers are like literally the center of the universe in my mind because they're the portals of life and they are the lifeline for all babies and children as they are growing up. Like quite literally they cannot live without a mother's breast milk, right? So I look at mothers in society as like the center of the universe now. And I did not see it that way before spending so much time in an Indigenous community. And that's because that's mostly, I don't want to generalize, but mostly that is how women are seen in Indigenous communities is like the mothers, care for the mothers. Do the mothers have support? Do the mothers have people around helping them raise their kids? Do the mothers have enough food? Do the mothers have enough community, essentially? And so mothers are very supported where I live. Grandmothers are not to be fucked with. Like, no joke. Grandmothers are not to be messed around with. Grandmothers are like fierce, fierce warriors in their communities. And I think a lot about like this vision that we have of grandmothers and older women in the West, where we've just completely discredited them. Like the moment that they are past reproductive age, we're like, okay, ciao, like you have no value. Versus in an Indigenous community, the grandmother of the community, she runs the game, bro. Like people do not fuck with her. You walk into a grandmother's house and you show up with like the deepest respect. And so I was seeing these visions of womanhood and motherhood and grandmotherhood and elder women, this archetype of the crone. And I was like, shit, that's pretty dope, honestly. Like what we have going on here, what you guys are doing, this is what all of my ancestors once did, because this is how all of our societies were once aligned. They were, generally speaking, very matrilineal because that was actually the only thing that you could legitimately track before we had like DNA tests within the past, I don't know, couple decades. People didn't actually know who their fathers were. And so for a vast majority of human history in cultures worldwide, we were matrilineal. We got all of our kind of inheritance from our mothers. And we tracked our line through our mothers because we couldn't 100% say who our father was going to be, especially within cultures that were not monogamous, which was a very large majority of cultures for a large majority of human history. There was collective fatherhood, actually, because fathers didn't know exactly who their baby was. So we were all matrilineal at one point in time, and women were running the game. There was balance between the sexes. It was very egalitarian a lot of the time. Women had specific community roles, men had specific community roles. There was a lot more freedom and a lot more flexibility in the past. But we tracked our inheritance through a matrilineal line. And so more and more and more, I was just like, okay, I'm getting right with womanhood, actually. Womanhood is not seeming like something really painful anymore. Womanhood is not seeming like oppression to me anymore, or like my experiences of so much gender-based violence. Like, there is another side to womanhood that I can embrace. There is another version that I can really get into, and I have to find what that's going to look like for me, right? Because I'm not an indigenous woman from the jungle. I never will be. It doesn't matter how much time I spend here in this community. That's not who I am. That's not my lineage. That's not where I've come from. And so, what is my version of womanhood going to be? What is my version of motherhood going to be? What is my version of female elderhood going to look like? I get to create that for myself. And it's really okay for me to be a woman. It actually is so beautiful and so sacred and pretty fucking badass to do this in this life. And I'm actually really happy that I chose to be a woman in this version of things. When I went through this process of coming into right relationship with womanhood, something else really started to change, which there were two things actually that started to change. A lot of my female reproductive health issues that I had been dealing with, more and more and more and more, started coming into balance. I was learning how to really take care of my womb, how to really take care of my moon time, so my bleeding time, which I was taught a lot about by the women in the village, and actually also by the men. The men taught me a lot of things about how to care for myself on my moon, which I'll talk about in a future episode, because it was remarkable, actually, that the men even knew anything about how to care for a woman when she was bleeding. That was such a foreign concept to me, and now it's something that I'm like, yeah, no shit. All men should be offered the opportunity to care for women when they are bleeding on their periods. And yeah, I came into much better health with my womb and with my fertility as well. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that my relationship with my partner Vincent went through a really beautiful and drastic transformation. The more that I settled into womanhood and the less and less that I was fighting that, the more peace that we came into in our partnership. And our partnership isn't perfect. We're always working on things, but we have been through some really painful chapters in our relationship, and we're at a really good place now. There's so many reasons for that, but one of them I can certainly say is the fact that I stopped fighting womanhood. I stopped fighting my feminine nature. I stopped fighting my biology. Like, I just stopped fighting, And I just surrendered and I said, yeah, this is true. This is who I am. This is where I'm at. So I'm really happy to be where I'm at now. I'm really, really at peace with womanhood finally for the first time in my life. It's the first moment where I feel like I can look at my body and to look at all that it's capable of, and to understand what a gift it is to be a woman in this world and in this life, and to not hate it, and to not fight it, and to not be scared of it, and to not try to change it and manipulate it, but to just really be like, okay, I'm a woman. Thank God I'm a woman. I love being a woman. Wow. I love this. Thank you. And with that, I'll touch back on something that I mentioned earlier, which is then understanding how to come into right relationship with white womanhood and my European lineage and all of the pain and suffering that white women have gone through, particularly if we go way back to Mother Europe and we go through that period of time before my ancestors left and came to Turtle Island. What was going on over there, which I'm going to do a whole episode dedicated to whiteness and white shame and white guilt and ancestor work, and particularly all of the work that I've been doing as a white woman to get right with all of that. But that door couldn't even be opened until I was able to say, okay, yeah, like womanhood is okay for me. That's what I am. And so then after that was when it was like, okay, now let's look at whiteness, because this is something that you are trying really, really hard to get away from and you can't. So let's look at it. I'll talk about all of that in a future episode, but I could go on and on and on. I could really go on and on and on about all of this. There's so much to it. And I will also say that I'm really grateful for this whole path that I've been on with my gender. I don't regret a single part of it. When I look back on it now, I'm just like, yeah, that's really what I had to go through in order to get to where I am now. If I had skipped any steps, where I am now would not make sense. I had to go to all of the extreme ends of like hating my femininity and hating my womanhood and my girlhood with every fiber of my being in order for me to get to a point where I just broke. And also in order for me to get to a point where I really understood that the vast majority of all of my resistance towards my gender was actually sexual abuse. I am not saying that that is the story for everyone. As I said at the beginning of this episode, gender is really personal. Everyone's experience is very individual. I just know that for me, that piece of understanding like the sexual abuse and the sexual violence that I experienced since I was a child and the lack of safety that I then felt in a female body, that was the key that really unlocked everything. And so I'm grateful to have gotten to the point in my path where I could sit with that reality and where I could see what happened to me and where I could start doing the deep work of healing that was very slow and very hard, but really, really, really worth it. So thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen. And for the Patreon offering for this episode, I think that what I would really love to share more about is some of the resources that helped me get a little bit more curious around my gender and take very slow steps to come back to womanhood. And that's like resources that are accessible to anyone, not just people who have the ability to live in the jungle for over a year in an indigenous village. But things that I found like online, some great podcasts, some books, some websites and like pamphlets and all of that kind of stuff. I'm going to talk more about that and the impact that those offerings had. And also just, yeah, more of my shifting views around, how to say, like, what's going on in the world right now when it comes to gender politics and my perspective on things and how I'm always changing my mind as I learn more and more and more. But just figuring out, okay, like, how can we actually support people really well who are going through gender dysphoria? How can we genuinely offer people the understanding and the relief that they really need and the care and the healing that they really need? What does that actually look like? And are we actually doing that right now? Is there a better way that we can show up for people? So I'm going to be sharing more about that on the Patreon for subscribers. So again, thank you guys so much for taking the time to listen to a little bit of my story when it comes to my gender, and I look forward to seeing what stories come in the future. All right.